Let's start with your interest in trains. When did you first become interested in trains and why?
Well, when I grew up, my dad had a piece of plywood in the basement that was 4x8, and it had a loop of track on it, and we ran Lionel O-scale. And from that, I got interested in slot cars. My best friend was interested in the trains. He had a slot car layout in his basement. I had a train layout in my basement. And we ended up spending more time in my basement than in his, and it just kind of focused over to the trains. At the same time, I grew up in my grandfather's machine shop, and it was the typical perfectionist German machinist. Everything had to be right. There was a reason for everything being right, and you learned the discipline of hard work, of good work, and all the axioms that went along with that. So my grandfather had worked for the railroads in 1917, 1918. He worked for the Erie in Marion, Ohio, and then he moved to Lima and worked for the Lake Erie and Western. And he fired some of the first Mikes that they got, which I think the nickel plate 587 was one of that order. 1918 for the Lake Erie and Western. First engines they had that had electric lights on them and stokers. So he had quite a few stories to tell about that. But he taught me an appreciation for man's inventions and how man's inventions have benefited mankind. And in that whole discussion, it became kind of recognized, self-recognized really, that man's greatest invention was the steam locomotive, man's most beneficial invention. And my grandfather had grown up riding a horse to school, and in his lifetime saw a man walk on the moon. And his perspective in how mankind's inventions had benefited mankind, I thought he had a pretty good perspective on it, and he still stayed with the steam locomotive over saying airplanes or something like that. So my grandfather and I would take some trips looking at locomotives that were on display. We went to Columbus, Ohio. We rode the N&W 578 when it was running, and just weekend travels looking at engines in city parks and things like that. When the 4501 ran from Chicago on the Independence Limited in 1973, my grandfather and I had tickets to ride that train, but my grandfather fell and broke his hip a couple weeks before, so I went with my brother, and we rode it from Chicago to Fort Wayne. When we pulled into Fort Wayne, they made an announcement on the train that the local Railroad Historical Society had a locomotive on the display in the city park 2 blocks away, and it would be open for people to go walk through. And that was the nickel plate 767 at that time. And my father had gotten up at 3 in the morning to drive us to Chicago and get on this train, and we were not going to go 2 blocks down the street and spend any more time in that day to visit another steam engine. But as things worked out, Wayne York got in contact with me a couple weeks later, and a month later I was back in Fort Wayne. We were crawling all over 765. And at that time, the group was not organized to where they had memberships yet or anything, but I'm standing there knocking on the door saying, I'm ready, let's go. And the group got organized, and we got a lease with the city and moved the engine out of the park in 1974, moved it to a little piece of land out in the country out east of New Haven, and the group decided that they were not going to start the restoration on it till they'd raised the money that would be needed. So at that time, they were going to visit Lions clubs and PTA and whatever, and giving this little spiel and asking for money, and they could raise $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year, and that got us to the point in 1976 we started the restoration. We had Doyle McCormick come to town to look at the engine, and he brought nickel plate master boilermaker Joe Carroll to look at the engine, and both of them agreed it was in pretty good shape. It had only sat in the park 11 years. It had some rust on it, but really most of it was just a matter of taking things apart, cleaning them up, put them back together. So from 76 to 79, we worked on restoring the 765. The restoration cost $40,000. And it ran until 1995, effectively, with a couple rebuilds and retubes in between. Growing up in St. Mary's, Ohio, St. Mary's was the beginning of the Minster branch, which went 10 miles straight south. And I felt that that railroad was a perfect opportunity for a tourist railroad, steam tourist line. So I expected my grandfather to be with me on this idea. And we made phone calls around the country. We looked at several engines, and at that time, Ron Zeal had, I think, 1 or 2 Brooklyn East District Terminal 060s available, and I was sure that one of those would be great for that line. And it became apparent that my grandfather wasn't going to pay for it. I couldn't pay for it. It was just a dream. But the realization was you're going to have to get into a business that makes a lot of money so that you can have your own money to spend on this railroad. And I talked to several people, and they said, well, architects make a lot of money. All right, I'll go to school for architecture. And I went to college for civil engineering and architecture. And when I graduated college, they said, oh, we've graduated quite a few architects lately. There's not really much demand for it. So I ended up at the Norfolk and Western Division offices in Muncie, Indiana, looking for a summer job on a track gang, which would allow me winters to drive around the country and look at steam engines in parks and whatever else. When I got there to apply for that job, they had no interest in talking to somebody that wanted to work on a track gang, and they didn't treat me very well. So I said, well, if it makes any difference, I have an engineering degree. Come right in, sit right down, can I get you a cup of coffee? And they hired me in the engineering department at Muncie. It was a 1,200-mile division, 6 people in the office, and we took care of all the civil engineering requirements of running at 1,200 miles of railroad. So we would deal with drainage problems, culverts, bridges. We would stake out new tracks for grain mills. We would do a lot of surveying for proposed new tracks. And the 2 big projects that I got involved with was the Demund connection at Lafayette, which laid new track across virgin ground to connect the Lake Erie and Western District with the former Wabash, and also acquiring a Pennsy line from Newcastle, Indiana down to Cincinnati, and making the second physical connection between the nickel plate Wabash tracks and the original N&W tracks. When the merger took place in '64, there was no physical connection between the railroads. So at that time, the N&W bought a Pennsy line that went north from Columbus to Sandusky through Bellevue, and that was the physical connection. And here we were in 1976 rebuilding this Pennsy line connecting from Muncie down to Cincinnati for the second physical connection between the merger partners. And then later that line was modernized from Muncie up to Fort Wayne, and it became really a big connection, a big contributing part to traffic flow on that soon became Norfolk Southern.
I remember you telling me when you first started working on that line, there were like telephone pole lines or people had clothing lines.
Sure. When we, well, first of all, we walked the line, hand measuring, hand wheeling the surveys and checking the right-of-way maps. And when we walked down through there, it had been out of service for 10 years probably. People had installed cable TV, power, telephone lines, which in a lot of cases we could just reach up and hit them. And my boss says, I want you to take that burro crane and put that tip of that boom up at 22 feet and drive it down that railroad. And we tore down unbelievable amounts of cables, telephone lines, and what else. That was a Penzi standard line. All the curves were 1 degree. The elevation was 1 inch per degree usually. And the line was built for 90 mile an hour. So keeping in mind that I figured the 765 had a chance of running across that line at some point in the future, I tweaked the N&W standard practice a little bit, and I think I probably put twice as much elevation in the curves there as the book called for, but it made it nice when we went down through there at 60 on the 765.
I bet NS loves you for that.
Nobody ever knew.
Until now.
Until now.
We started the company in August of '78, mostly as an industrial track work company, track repair. And in the Fort Wayne area, we probably serviced customers for about a 100-mile radius. And this worked well for a couple years. Dick Yeager and Larry Randolph were my partners when we started it. And we did industrial track work in the summer, and in the winter when the tracks were frozen, we worked on steam locomotives. And our first contract rebuild was 1980 for Jerry Jacobson and the Jackson Iron and Steel number 3, which is now Baldwin Switcher number 26 at Steamtown. That was our first job. Well, after the 765, that was all volunteer work. That wasn't diversified. But through the
Same knowledge base.
yeah, and through the years, the diversified contracts to restore engines, we restored quite a few of the engines owned by Ohio Central, Jerry Jacobson. Did the boiler work on them. We did the engines for the Grand Canyon. Right after that, 1990.
Talk about that a little bit.
The project at the Grand Canyon was a great big idea that just had to happen quick. There were several false starts. There was an opening day that was chosen that was the anniversary of the railroad. I think the 90th anniversary or the 99th maybe. And we were looking for American-built locomotives that were fairly modern. So there were quite a few locomotives built in 1949 that were shipped to China. And we went to China looking for those engines. We found them. We picked out one of them out of the storage line. The next day it was in the shop under hydro. The next day it was in the shop running. And we wanted it. We wanted 4 of them, 5 of them. And when we got back from China to try to continue the deal, several weeks later was the Tiananmen Square massacre, and there were no more conversations. That left us 6 months before opening day without locomotives. And we went back to Marquette, Michigan, where we had previously done work on the 18 for about the second or third owner that owned it after the LS&I. And that engine had a lot of work done on it previous to 1989, and then that project was abandoned, so the engine was sitting there. It was the, engine closest to running of all of them that we could possibly go buy. And we bought it, started working on it 16 hours a day up in Michigan, loaded it on flat cars, shipped them to Arizona. When they arrived there, we started working on them, working on the 18 probably a week before the cranes showed up to unload it. and then continued working on it 16 hours a day for the next 30 days, and ran the test run 4 a.m. on the day of the dedication, and ran it to the canyon and got the railroad in operation.
Incredible.
Shortly after that, we went to Austin, Texas, restored the SP 786 for the group there. After that, put a new firebox in the 604 at Spencer. We purchased the 1702 from Fremont, Nebraska, and took it to the Smoky Mountain, restored it, started the Smoky Mountain operation, or the steam operation there. After that, we were involved with a Milwaukee 261 restoration. After that, Sioux Line 1003, and then Sioux Line 2719. There's been...
And those are side by side and around, right?
One after the other, the restorations were, and then both engines ended up in the same roundhouse.
Wow.
And ran for several years until Canadian National took over the Wisconsin Central.
Now, wasn't there some sort of accident with one of those locomotives? I can't remember.
The Pacific was sideswiped during the night. The cars that were behind it, the brakes bled off, the handbrakes were ineffective. They rolled down, hit the engine, pushed it out foul of the main, and a freight train comes through and comes around a curve and sideswipes it. So...
Diversified had nothing to do with it.
No, we were involved in the operation, but this was all under the management of the owner of the engine at that time. But that got us into a total rebuild of the running gear because rods were broken, crank pins were sheared off, valve gear frame broken, a lot of iron castings were broken, and so we were able to replace a lot of those with weldments that we machined and then fit back into the frame, and actually had to lay out the entire valve gear, locate it, and put it back where it was supposed to be, and rebuild all of it. So.
Which is talk about how that's the first and only time valve gear has actually been truly timed.
Well, yeah.
The process gone through. Valves have been trailed. But not truly timed.
We talked about it at the time that was the first time that an engine's valve gear had been set from zero, because we had to locate the gear frame on the engine, we had to locate the eccentric cranks, the length of the cranks, the eccentric rods, the lengths of the rods, the arc of the washer lengths, and the radius rod, and every part of it.
That's really cool.
Let me say some more about that.
Sure, absolutely.
At that same time, the Frisco 1522 in St. Louis had derailed and been damaged by the re-railing effort, and that was also the case in Wisconsin with the 2719. There was as much damage done to the engine by the re-railing effort than there was from the accident. But that got us into a full scope of work to repair everything, and the engine came out with the running gear pretty much 100%, and it was right. That engine ran 55 mile an hour for most of the day, and the axle temperatures were 100 degrees. So it was right, and it acted right. 1522, we went through a rebuild on that at almost the same time, and it came out pretty good, but not perfect, not like the Pacific. There was always a little bug somewhere in the 1522 that never got fixed 100%. The group has to present a field of experienced people that makes that railroad feel comfortable running that engine. And the engines have to perform. There can't be any excuses. They have to be right, they have to perform. So we've always found a lot of success in following the railroad's published standard practices. There's no reason not to follow those practices because they ran thousands and thousands of engines using those practices. And we always felt that if you performed the repair work the way they did, you could expect to get the results they got, which were engines that ran thousands and thousands of miles pretty much trouble-free. We don't subscribe to the discussion that these old engines just can't be what they used to be. You just can't expect them to be right. Well, you can expect them to be 100%. You can expect them to be powerful, economic, and reliable. The Malley is an American distortion of the pronunciation of the man that invented the concept of two engines under one boiler, the front one being articulated. Mr. Mallet was French, I think, in the 1870s possibly. But in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, American railroads pushed that mechanism as far as it probably could go. The other aspect of a Mallet was compound use of the steam. So the steam enters the rear cylinders, works there at high pressure, it's exhausted at a lower pressure to the front engine, the larger low pressure cylinders, and it works there, and then it's exhausted out the stack. And that allowed development of bigger, more powerful engines at that time. That was the technology in those days. They couldn't get engines any taller, any wider, but they could get them longer. And you ended up with massive engines, you know, the Erie triplex, which was 28882, and Virginian 210-10-2s, that type of thing. The cylinders were so big on the Virginian 210-10-2s that they couldn't be shipped on a regular railroad. They had the cylinders off of them, shipped them to the Virginian, and then finished building the engine there and ran it only on their railroad where they could make the clearances work.
Why did railroads kind of go away from the compound style of steam locomotive?
The technological development in the 20s that got you a boiler big enough to boil enough steam to run two engines in simple under that boiler. That was the next big window of technical opportunity. Previously, they were using all the steam the boiler could produce. They weren't able to produce much more, so they compounded it, and that was an answer for that time. But after that, once Lima developed the superpower concept, a big enough boiler that could produce more steam than the cylinders could ever use, that was their initial presentation on the Berkshires, which then they found the boilers were big enough to run two Berkshires. So then you got simple articulateds that ended up being 2882s, 4884s, you know, 4664s that had required a tremendous amount of steam, but the boilers were able to produce it, and you ended up with the most powerful engines that were ever built. Well, I think the 1309 is an engine well suited to this railroad. It's a mountain railroad. It's 16 miles of 1%, which isn't a real nasty grade, but it's a consistent grade, and it will allow the engine to work, compound, and pull up this hill. I don't see any real operational problems with it doing that. It's going to do it economically and reliably. And you'll see, once it gets running, we can get some numbers in our experience. You'll see it gets pretty economic. And that's the benefit of the compound. Well, so much of it, well, all of this work is handwork. And I was privileged to know quite a few of the people that worked for the railroads in the days of steam. And every one of them that I knew loved it. They loved the career that they had. They loved putting something of themselves into these engines, be it machinery, their competence and their capabilities for running the machines that trued the wheels and the running gear or made the boilers. Every other aspect of it, it was all handmade, hand-built, and pretty much, hand-maintained. And it all is a performance exhibition of those guys' capabilities.
So Gary, just because we're here, and just because you're all mic'd up and everything, and because this is one of my favorite Gary stories, could you tell me about the conductor's song on the Illinois Central? Because I think you tell this story better than anybody. So what is the conductor's song on the Illinois Central?
Well, in Arlo Guthrie's song, The City of New Orleans, one of the phrases is, the conductor sings his song again, the passengers will please refrain. That's all you hear about it in the song. But the conductor's song was, passengers will please refrain from flushing toilets while the train is standing in the station, we love you. We encourage constipation while the train is in the station. If the train can wait there, why can't you? I was riding on the City of New Orleans and went to the diner, and the diner was full of people, and I'm watching this old black man serve this diner, and it was rough track. Illinois Central was terrible, and this was probably in the late 80s. And this guy obviously had worked for the Pullman Company from when he started working, probably, and ended his career working for Amtrak. But he had all of the tricks of how to survive, how to provide good service on a rocking and rolling train down the junk Illinois Central. And I'm watching, he'd walk up to a table, he'd plant his foot next to the table leg, and he'd kick his leg against the table leg, and that steadied him. And he was reaching out over the table with the coffee pot and the spout away from him, and he was serving coffee like straight away, not sideways, straight away. And he turned around and set it on the table behind him to take care of the table he was waiting on. And behind him, there were two women at that table. They picked up the coffee pot and served themselves. And he turns around and goes, "Oh, no, ma'am. That's my job. That's my job. I'll be serving you." And away he goes. He comes to the table behind me, which I'm sorry to say was 4 young black youths that were bad attitude, big mouths, causing trouble on this train. And this guy comes to that table, he's pouring them coffee, and one of them says, "You spill a drop of that on me, old man, I'll own this train." And I see his leg kind of get stiff against the table, and he's reaching out over like that, pouring the coffee, and he says, "I don't spill a drop, and you won't own shit. Have a nice day." And that was pretty good.
That's one of my favorite stories that I think I've ever heard. Does anyone else have a Gary story that they would like him to recall about a locomotive, about...
Tell them about the bear.
What?
The bear.
Which bear?
The one you about ran over.
That's not a locomotive story.
It's okay, it's a Gary story.
Nah.
Okay, talk about the 1522.
With the 1522 on the Employee Appreciation Special down in Texas, we had quite a few days of operation, I think 36 days. And coming back, we came up through Oklahoma, got on the Transcon, and we're headed back to Kansas City, and we're down the middle track of the Transcon doing 60, and on this side of us comes a double stack, and on this side is a TTX flats UPS train, and they're both doing 70. And at that time, we had decided that there would always be a mechanical representative in the cab listening to the engine, because the operating crew was sitting there wearing David Clark's, and you can't hear a thing for the engine. So I was in the cab listening. The rest of the guys, Jeff Schmidt was running and Welly Lazier is firing. And Jeff looks around at me, and I just said, things are fine, sounds good. And off we go, and he ends up doing 70, 72. We're in between these trains, and there's 3 trains coming down through the railroad, blowing away these little towns at 70 miles an hour, and we're just praying somebody doesn't get stupid up there and freeze in between them, in between tracks or something. And that went for 20 miles maybe, and we had to stop for water, but it was great while it lasted. And a good exhibition of performance of the engine. It wasn't 100%, but it was doing pretty good that day.
Why don't you tell us the story that Rich Melvin stole from you?
Yeah.
Yes!
Please. Set the record straight.
Can't.
Record be corrected.
Now, whose copyright would we violate if we did that?
Nobody's, because it's your story.
Been established.
Doesn't have a copyright.
Right.
Let's get the record straight, Gary. Tell us about the hill.
Nope.
Come on.
You've heard that story.
Oh, I know, but you got to tell your story. You got to tell your.
We heard it from the person who's most expertly copied it.
I'd have to listen to what he said before, because there's certain aspects of it that weren't covered. But
Well, let's get the real story. We don't want fake news.
when we were running the 765 out of Buffalo in the mid 80s, we were running east to Corning, New York, and it's on the Erie, and it seemed almost every place we went, every division we went to, a crew would climb up on the engine in the morning and go, you know, we got a pretty stiff hill out here today. And there's always, it seems like there's always that legend of the hill on this division, that division, every division. And on this division, it was Attica Hill. And the tracks came eastbound, down a little bit of a hill into town, around a left-hand curve past the front of Attica Prison and up Attica Hill. And they said, what speed do you think you'll be going at the top of the hill? And I said, what's the speed limit at the bottom of the hill? He said, 35. I said, well, we'll go over the top at 35. And they're going, oh, we've never seen a train do that. But when we got to it, I was running, John Snyder was firing, and we get into the hill, and it, you know, you're throttling up and you're balancing the power, and we were maintaining 35 up the hill. And the road foreman's sitting there going, boy, this thing pulls pretty good. And one of the cars, a brake hose hit a timber on a road crossing and popped the hose, and the train goes into emergency. And we stop on that hill, and John's trying to cool things down. All 3 pops are up, and we're sitting there, and the pops were up, the injector's on. That thing was hot as it could be, and it took 5 minutes or more to get it to where the pops seated. And they found the problem with the brake hose. They put the train back together. And then they say, you'll never be able to start this train on this hill. Well, I said, well, anything that we can pull up this hill, we can start on this hill. And we started out, no problem, no slipping, barking, you know, shooting holes in the sky with that Baker exhaust, and went on up the hill and got back to 35 before we got to the top, and did it again the next day without going into emergency. So
That's awesome.
Thankfully, there was nobody out there to grease the rails.
yeah, no saboteurs along the line.
My goodness, my goodness. Anybody else have a Gary story that they'd like to ask?
Hey, what are
The runaway of the 2700.
2705.
Oh, okay.
From the career of Mr. L.G. Lowe, engineer on the Clinchfield Railroad, who ran, I'd say his career spanned from 1920 to 1964 maybe. He says in his career he ran every engine the Clinchfield ever owned. And in that time, he was able to identify, I gotta get this fixed.
Okay, yep.
In his career, he was able to identify that there are 3 types of steam locomotives. There's them Mikey types, and there's them Malley types, and there's them high-wheeled passenger engines. And I said, well, Mr. Lowe, here's an 060, that's a Mikey type. Here's an 080, that's a Mikey type. Here's a 284, that's a Mikey type. And then it's obvious what the Malley types were, and then the high-wheeled passenger engines was his favorite to run. That's a long story because every day some disaster happened.
Like where it rolled down the hill. with
Right,
the air on it.
right. But the Copper Ridge story, we replayed the Copper Ridge story on Ashtabula. I forget the name of that hill. But when we leased the 765 to the Southern in 1982, I was still responsible for the boiler washes. We kept Fort Wayne reporting papers and cab cards and everything. So I went down 3 times to do monthlies on it. And when we got into Atlanta and I show up to do the monthly, they said, boy, you missed it. We came down over Copper Ridge to get here. And Copper Ridge was, as I understand it, the shortcut between Oneida or Harriman Junction and Knoxville. And I said, what happened? They said, well, we had 17 cars and we went up over Copper Ridge, and Mr. Purdy says this engine, and the best he could say, this engine did pretty good. It would not slip, it would not stall. And Mark Brainerd was the fireman, and I turned to Mark, I said, how long was it between exhausts? And he said, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. And he said, we're dragging this train up over this backside of this mountain, and the people in this town could hear us coming for a half an hour. Everybody in the town was out by the tracks. They were all walking alongside the engine, and every time it would exhaust, a cheer would go up from the crowd. And he says, they're all walking along beside the engine, and Bill Purdy says, why, a little baby child could have crawled along the ties faster than we was rolling. And so that's always been the standard by which progress is measured. Because there's been a time or two that I look down at the ties and go, yeah, a little baby child could crawl about this fast.
Ashtabula, 0.6.
Yeah, was that 16? 15 we were there. So we're running the NS employee specials, and in 2015 we left Fort Wayne and deadheaded to Youngstown, and we go east on the nickel plate, get off of the nickel plate at Ashtabula and get onto a New York Central line that went down to Youngstown from the harbor at Ashtabula. And it was that Heartland Hill? No. There's a different name of that hill. But we come around the interchange track at 10 mile an hour. We get out on the main at 10 mile an hour, and the crew says, well, this is only 10 mile an hour. So we're going 10 mile an hour, and then I look up ahead and the hill is going like this, and I look up ahead and the hill goes like that. And they said, oh yeah, it gets a little steeper at the top. And we get up towards the top, and we are wide open, 245 pounds on the boiler, 245 pounds in the steam chest, and doing a half a mile an hour. And doing 3 seconds between exhausts, maybe 2 seconds. And the crew calls the dispatcher and says, we've stalled. And I said, we're still moving, don't tell them that yet. And Jason Subchinski is firing, and I called him over to look at the gauges, and we had the same pressure in the cylinders as we did the boiler. And I wasn't feeling that we were gaining any speed. And I said, we need more pressure. So he goes over and starts firing it over the pops, and gets the boiler up to a pressure that I don't think it ever ran at previously, over the pops. And it made a difference, and we could feel that we were going to gain a little steam, gain a little speed, and make it over. And when we did get up over the top, there's plenty of videos of this, I didn't shut it down. Left it wide open, hooked it up as we gained speed, and we got right up to 40 mile an hour quick, and went on into Youngstown. But it was a engine performance exhibition that day.
One of the very few days in 2015 I wasn't around.
Yeah.
The 425.
You missed it. You should have.
Oh, I know.
You should have looked at those. Oh, there's plenty of videos to go watch.
I've seen the videos.
Because the first in Carson Hill, I had researched Carson Hill after we went up it that day, and the New York Central blew up 2 of their great big mics on that hill. One of them going up it, one of them right around past the interchange track, and it said it peppered the shovel and hoe works with arch brick and stuff, and hurt a couple people in the factory next to the track. And the other one was blown up coming down Carson Hill, a double header, and the front engine blew up. And I'm reading this report, and it become apparent that apparently the yardmaster said, get this thing out of here. And the engineer and the fireman on the lead engine said, we're not ready to go. Get this thing out of here. And the engine noses over and heads down the hill, and they set the brakes, and all the water goes to the front. The crown is exposed, and in that explosion it killed the engineer and the fireman, but the brakeman, the head brakeman, was on the back of the tender, and I can imagine he says, the heck with this, I'm getting out of here, and he got over the slope sheet to the back deck before it blew, and he survived.
Now, here's something, because this goes to the Ashtabula thing, right? So, what is the rated horsepower of the 765? What are they?
2354 or something like that.
Okay, is that low?
I think so.
Shoot. It's higher. No, it's 3.
Or, no, it ain't over 3. It's 20. It might be 2754.
Because after that whole Ashtabula thing, we knew the grade, we knew the weight of all the cars, and we knew what speed we were going. At 0.6 miles an hour, half a mile an hour, in order to keep that amount of weight moving up that hill, the 765 was putting out 1,600 horsepower over whatever it's rated at.
Yeah.
And I figured that out based upon standards for developing, or determining rather, actual horsepower in the simplest form, pulling or moving weight up a given incline at a given speed.
Yeah.
And then coupled that along with determining the horsepower of a steam engine, but stationary steam, not drawbar horsepower. So in very, very raw forms, the 765 put out 1,600 horsepower over what it was rated on Carson Hill when you were running.
Yeah.
So it's a cool little story.
I think there's plenty of recognition in the service life of those engines that they produced a lot more horsepower than what the book said it did.
4,500,
Was what it would have been.
the rated horsepower of the bird.
It wasn't making 6,000. Is that what you want to say?
It was 5,700, so I was wrong.
Oh.
It was 1,200 more.
No.
Wow. Still, that's
So that was the number. 5,700 is the number, regardless of everything else. 5,700.
Well, and at that point, when the engine's running 100%, the throttle's ineffective,
Yep.
and I'm sitting there playing with the throttle. I started closing the throttle down to see how far you could close it, and it would start to affect the pressure, and it was almost half closed. So I open it back up. I start changing the cutoff, and there wasn't much way to make that change. So everything about the steam circuit on that engine was designed right and was making all the horsepower it could.
incredible. The Cincinnati Northern, because I might do a video on them someday. Why are you so interested in the Cincinnati Northern, and just in general, what makes the Cincinnati Northern so unique in your mind?
The Cincinnati Northern was just a local railroad around where I grew up, and when I was in college in Dayton, I started working with the Bloom brothers on the Little River Railroad 110. When we had it ready to move up to Angola, Indiana, Penn Central took it up the Cincinnati Northern from Ansonia, I think, to Van Wert, over the Pennsy Main from Van Wert to Fort Wayne, up out of Fort Wayne on the GR&I, and then over around some other route in Michigan that got it back down to Angola. So it was neat to say that I rode the last steam engine that moved across the Cincinnati Northern. But beyond that, it was just a neat little secondary line. It was a New York Central line, and they had shops at Van Wert, Ohio. I had walked through those shops and looked at everything that was still there, and they had a wooden coach sitting on the ground outside in the yard that was used as a crew restroom. One of the days, and this thing was abandoned and fallen down, and one of the days I walked around in there looking in the clear story windows, the light caught them just right, and there was a pattern in them. And Scott Trossel and I preserved those windows, historical preservation,
Wink, wink.
and stripped the paint off on them. They were all etched and hand-cut rosette glass all down the side. And we got to the window at the end of the coach, and it had in smoke script Cincinnati Northern on that window.
Are you gonna will that?
And that window,
Are you gonna will that window?
Drayton Blackgrove has requested that I will that window to him. And I really haven't seen a real good reason to do that yet. Oh!
I love that. That's so great.
But I found some records.
Yeah, the Drayton Foundation for a Better Life.
That's right.
Available on GoFundMe.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
I found some interesting records in the Lake States Archives up at Baraboo, Wisconsin, that showed a request for expenditure from the TP&W Railroad that they bought some 280s second-hand from the Cincinnati Northern, took them to Peoria, modified them, rebuilt them, and probably ran them there for another 20 years before they scrapped them.
That's really cool.
I've been looking for pictures of them, and I've seen a couple pictures of TP&W engines that may be those Cincinnati Northern engines.
Really cool. Really cool. Anybody else have a Gary story that they might want recorded?
Well,
You have one, Mike?
I got the hill straight out. I can't believe I didn't even think
The
about
one
that.
I want recorded for posterity, he probably won't tell.
I'll tell the one when we pulled in behind the choo-choo with Purdy. That was a good one. Ready?
Yeah.
When we leased the 765 to the Southern in '82, the last trip, that it ran was an excursion from Birmingham to Chattanooga and back. And as we ran up to Chattanooga, we pull into town, and we're pulling past the choo-choo, and we're pulling back around the back of the National Cemetery. And I was standing beside Bill Purdy, and he looks over at the National Cemetery, and he looks at me, he says, "Yonder lay them Yankee bastards that tried to come down here and steal our locomotive." And I said, "Are you referring to those gallant Ohio boys, the winners of the first Congressional Medal of Honor in that great war twixt the blue and the yeller?" And he got smoking hot, really pissed that I had not allowed the Southern gray to be discussed in that conversation. You know, each of them was the result of the power and the influence of a couple individuals in the management. Robert Claytor and on the Southern, Graham Claytor. Who am I forgetting? The lawyer.
The lawyer. The Claytors and the lawyer.
No, Mr. Beislein. Yeah. The early version of it was allowed to happen because Bob Claytor encouraged it. Graham Claytor had encouraged it to start, and it started on the Southern. And then when Bob Claytor was in the management of Norfolk Southern, he allowed it to be operated there also. And exactly why it ended, change of management, I guess. A lot of people felt that it had run its course, and really what wasn't recognized was the great benefit that that program was to every NRHS chapter along the route that sold tickets and made enough money to operate for another year and sponsor the trip the next year. But
Would you say that that was the NRH's cash cow, and it wasn't necessarily beneficial for NS as a whole?
It probably ended up having that effect, yeah. There were NRHS people thought it was owed to them to come and run their trip again next year, and the NS didn't owe anything to anybody. It was all their decision and their doing. But in 2013, when it was revived by Wick Moorman, pretty much the same situation. A person in management that was favorable to that kind of a thing saw the benefit of it and allowed it to happen. And it happened as long as he was there allowing it. When management changed, then it changed also.
Why do you think it's valuable for Class 1 railroads to do such things? Like, we're seeing some amazing things out west. Actually, yesterday the big boy rang for the first time in 60 years.
All right.
Why is it important for Class 1s to do that, and should NS?
Well, I think the UP has kept it in their corporate culture for 150 years that they were a very large part of the building of this country, the westward expansion, and they've kept that perspective that they were a very big part of the development of the country. And other railroads have gone through, the ebb and flow of public attitude, and some of them almost being ashamed to be in the railroad business. I never knew a lifelong railroader that was ashamed of it, but maybe some executive that come over from some other industry and took a job there, found himself in an industry he didn't understand, and sometimes would say that they weren't proud of. So that's certainly not helpful. The railroads seem to not really want to identify with the greatest thing that they are identified with is operating steam locomotives. And that represents a time when the country was vibrant and growing and doing everything that was possible And the railroads had gone from boom to bust to boom and back to bust several cycles. And lately they're in a boom cycle, and they've told the preservationists that there's no time on the railroad for these extra trains. But the UP has kept it in their culture that it is important. And if you want to be in the management of UP, that's one of the things you're going to subscribe to, or there's no place in the management for you. I hope that's how it's done internally. Well, it's always been my goal that those rewards come from the performance of the engine. The performance of the engine is the confirmation of our work, our competency and our hard work, that we know the engines are capable and can perform, and we're going to do everything that we can. First of all, educate ourselves of how it needs to be handled, how the work needs to be done, so that we can get the performance out of them. There seems to be, to answer your question, there's vivid memories of almost every engine that we've been involved with, of a time where you're buzzing along at night and the stars are out and everything is going great. Or it's like Steve Sandberg says, welcome to the world of mainline steam locomotive operation. In this world, you'll reach your highest highs of your life and your lowest lows, sometimes on the same day. But when we used to run the New River trains and we come back, deadheading back from Hinton to Huntington, we're coming through Charleston, it's daybreak, 60 miles an hour, and people are just getting out and going to work, and we're just another train on the railroad. And we've been running 60 all night long. It's been a lot of situations like that that kind of seem to parallel themselves. Running the Sioux Pacific at night up through Wisconsin, or the Sioux Mike, the 1003, same kind of experience, and seeing the northern lights out the cab of that thing. Running the 765 at night, deadheading between excursion locations around New Jersey, and looking out the cab window and seeing the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. A lot of little memories like that I don't think you can say one was greater than another. Every one of them is a treasured experience to be thankful for, you know. Sure. I'd say, how many people in the world are doing this right now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us here. Well, it takes a life of study, really, to learn the disciplines, to learn the procedures, the practices. I felt that the structural engineering that I learned in college helped me understand locomotives better. Strength of materials, form of design, that just helps you understand the whole mechanism better. And I don't abide old wives' tales and urban legends. And I don't abide the dismissal that these old locomotives just can't be as good as they used to be. So it's a lot for a person to say, I'm going to study this as much as I can, I'm going to learn everything I can about it, and if I do that, I can make a living at it. That's great to maybe have that opportunity, but it's an opportunity that you pretty much have to develop on your own. And there's not a lot of opportunity coming your way to do that. We talk about big locomotives that we take out on the main line and run, and how many people are going to be able to experience that? Not a lot. But wherever somebody can decide they want to be involved, And I've always said every day, at the end of the day, you ask yourself whether you got out of it what you wanted today, and will you come back tomorrow? That's your decision. It's a question you can ask every day. I'd have to say it probably was running the first train into the Grand Canyon with the 18. And thousands of people are there on the ground, and the crowd's just opening up, and we're moving through. Kind of like the scene out of Polar Express. But I always told myself, you're in a situation that very, very few people get to be in. Don't ever take it for granted. Be thankful for it. And every day that you bring a train up here, walk over and look at that Grand Canyon and be thankful. Because not a lot of people ever get to be, in that situation.